Welcome to the Lightforge podcast. This is ADWCTA.
The Merps, hello. Hope you guys are having a good weekend so far. It's getting a little bit chilly, We're getting close to Halloween. Weather's turning. Hearthstone is still the same. Still very much so the same.
85 degrees here in Charlotte. Everything still
Yeah.
feels the same, including Hearthstone. All right, we're gonna do a throwback episode here because the meta is so throwback. Let's. I'm just gonna break it down from the beginning to the best of my ability, and we're gonna start at win rates, right? Um, on HS replay for this meta, the win rate right now, remember this is the post adjustment win rates. It's already been like a little over a week, so it's all new decks now pretty much. And you have Warlock sitting on top, 53.6%. Paladin is now still second at 52.8%, even though they nerfed Biggin to half. But that's why they're no longer on top. And then you have Shaman, then you have Demon Hunter, Mage, Priest, a little bit of a gap to Rogue at 47.6%. All those I just mentioned are like 51 to 49.7% win rate, so they're all good. And then Rogue is at 47.6%, Hunter at 44.4%. Now, Hunter just got nerfed again. That probably hasn't been taken into account yet. But when I say Hunter got nerfed again, I mean Hunter's actually got nerfed in the game, not like in Arena, their offering rates are nerfed, but they like adjusted down the wild seeds again in terms of power. Anyway, Druids are 42.3%, Warriors are 40%. So that's the win rate going down, and Warlocks are on top. And whenever we see a class on top, we're always looking at their like best cards, right? Like I'm trying to think back on when the last time we saw a class on top and we weren't focused on their totally ridiculous cards. And Warlocks, they have some totally ridiculous cards. Imprisoned Scrap Imp is coming in at 62.7% win rate on HS Replay. Mischievous Imp, which we rated, I don't know, did we rate it S tier? If not S tier, it was close to S tier. Probably S tier. Maybe A plus tier, I forget. But it's at 61%. Shadow Council, we all remember Shadow Council. Or if you haven't played this game for that long, that's the 1 mana epic spell that says replace your hand with random demons, give them +2/+2. It basically says win the game if you have it before like close to the end of the game. Or get super unlucky. Like this is RNG that even pro players need to use. But that's a rare card, another rare card, and an epic card. They are not actually seen in that many Warlock decks. Your fourth best non-legendary card and your best common card, you will never, ever, ever guess what it is unless you looked at HS Replay. I could give you 20 guesses and you will not guess this card. Because it is Ethereal Augmerchant. I'm going to say that again. It is Ethereal Augmerchant. And if you forget the names of the Augmerchants like I do, Ethereal Augmerchant is the Augmerchant that does nothing. You have your Rocket Augmerchant, which, gives someone rush potentially. You have your Guardian Augmerchant, which gives them Divine Shield. And then you have Ethereal Augmerchant, which gives spell damage, which means you're pretty much, especially as Warlock, you're pretty much never going to use it on your own minions. What you're going to do is just use it as a ping. Now, Ethereal Augmerchant has the next highest win rate because Imprisoned Scrap Imp is not why Warlocks are winning. Mischievous Imp is not why Warlocks are winning. Shadow Council is not why Warlocks are winning. Sure, they'll win you games if you happen to have them in your Warlock deck, but they just frankly don't show up in enough Warlock decks to be the driving force behind it. What is winning all the Warlocks games is also not Ethereal Augmerchant, by the way, in case you thought that's where I was headed. What's winning all the Warlock games is their hero power. I'll get back to Ethereal Augmerchant. I know it's a weird thing to put a pin in, and you guys are all like, what? How? What's the secret? I'll tell you the secret later. You may be able to figure it out before then. But Warlocks are number one because the game is so powered down after the patch. After the adjustments, it is so powered down that the Warlock hero power, which has always been the best hero power in the game outside of Demon Hunters, or maybe on the same level, is now absurdly powerful. And that's why you see that nothing else is really making that big of an impact. By the way, it's not like I'm like cherry picking, and after Ethereal Og Merchant, it's like a bajillion cards that are all Warlock class cards. After Ethereal Og Merchant is Sea Giant, then Murloc Tinyfin. Just throwing it out there. Like, I'm not cherry picking my data here. This is just what the game actually is. This is the Maw and Disorder meta, and this is how Warlocks are played. And if you face Warlocks in the game, you'll see that this is pretty much the case. We just got a 12-0 Warlock, and we had 2 Evil Geniuses and no other cards that are rated at A. By the way, the Og Merchants, I just rated it again just to give you guys an idea. It comes in at like a very low B, like the Ethereal Og Merchant, in terms of how good the card is, and that probably fits with your mental idea of how good an Ethereal Og Merchant is. This is not secretly the best card in the game, but it's also not that far away from like the 3rd best card in your entire deck these days. Like, you just have 1 really powerful card, maybe 2 really powerful cards, at best 3 really powerful cards, and by really powerful I mean A tier cards. And you used to have like 8 of these in a deck. So you have like 1, 2, 3, probably on average 2, maybe 1.5 even for the average deck. And your opponent has the same. And the rest of your cards are like Yetis and Yeti pluses. And that's what Ethereal Og Merchant is. It's a Yeti plus. It's definitely better than a Yeti, but it's not like crazily better than a Yeti. And that's all you are working with. So if your deck happens to synergize really well, or if one of your super ridiculous good cards is like a Sire or whatever, you will just win the game. But so few decks do that. So few decks do that. That in going through like my 12-1 Warlock on Friday, 12-0, I just kept evaluating my opponent's decks by the cards that I saw, and I counted every card from every opponent that played that was an A tier card or better, right? So no B pluses, no Bs definitely, but like A tier cards or better. And there's plenty of A tier cards. And I counted A tier cards that were played more than 2, meaning my opponent had drawn and played more than 2 A tier cards, exactly 3 times from 3 of my opponents. And they were like all towards the end. Like, they were like my 11-0 opponent, my like 9-0 opponent, and my 8-0 opponent or something. And our deck, we also, we only had 2 A tier cards as well. And most games we would not be able to draw and play both of them, obviously. So it's all kind of there. You're just mucking around here. You're mucking around, bumping Yetis. This is the bumping Yetis meta. We were saying this before, but with the Maw and Disorder rotation, everybody is out there doing some slightly fancier version of effectively bumping Yetis. Now, when you keep bumping Yetis, your hero power becomes really important. Because remember, back in the day, in Constructed, you would hero power almost every turn. And in Arena, you would hero power like every other turn. You would always be trying to squeeze a hero power in, like once you're off the curve. Why? Because the hero powers were like good cards. Like Shiv was one of the best rogue cards for the longest time. And that's basically the mage hero power. Like, these are totally fine things to do. And in the last 3-4 years, you stopped being able to just want a hero power. In fact, you really didn't want a hero power. Hero power became like a last resort kind of thing. Like, oh, I need to do something to fill the mana. Or, hey, I have a ping and my opponent has a 3-1 on the board. I'm going to need to ping that because that's not just a normal hero power now. Now I'm getting extra value from it. But you don't have to do any of that anymore. Right now, hero powers are just about your best option on the vast majority of your turns. Assuming you're not playing on curve. So that means like, turn 5 and after, or you just don't have a curve card. And
just what happens with like the rotation as well. You have a lot of really bad cards. So yeah, I mean, when your option is a bad 5-drop or an on curve 3-drop plus a hero power, it's like, yeah, sure, that's what your turn 5 will be, rather than just a bad 5-drop. And if you're bumping Yetis against each other, let's talk about that exact scenario, right? Literally bumping 2 Yetis into each other. that gets cleaned up with a hero power, right?
Mm-hmm.
That gets cleaned up with a ping. So this is why I'm talking about, like, on turn 5, if you're literally bumping Yetis up against each other, your play is a 3-drop plus a hero power to finish off that Yeti. So you see that quite often now.
Yeah, yeah. And if you look at the so with that ping, we're gonna start bringing the AUG merchants back now. So AUG merchants are generally B to B plus rated. Maybe you could say the Guardian AUG merchant is a B plus, or the Rocket AUG merchant is a B plus. I think that's a stretch. I think both of them. I think they're all B tier cards, with a Guardian AUG merchant maybe being a high B, not yet B plus, and Ethereal AUG merchant being a low B, and Rocket AUG merchant somewhere in the middle. But they do ping, and that's very important, especially for classes that don't normally have their pings. And we don't have a lot of pings in this meta, so that ping is super, super, super important for AUG merchants in general. Now, going into why Ethereal AUG merchant is the best AUG merchant, and not the two better AUG merchants. Like, they're better. Ethereal AUG merchant is the worst AUG merchant. It's the best in win rates, because the only people who draft Ethereal AUG merchants as if it's a super good card are the good players. This is entirely a function of good players draft Ethereal AUG merchants, because they realize the spell damage doesn't matter. It's still a 2/1/1 mana that pings, and that is very useful. And bad players underdraft Ethereal AUG merchant compared to what it is. So that's what's inflating the win rate. The amount of picks that Ethereal AUG merchant has compared to the other AUG merchants is less than half, according to HS Replay. So, sorry, not less than half. It's almost half. It's a little bit more than half. And it shouldn't be, because most of the time you're not rushing something. Most of the time you're not giving it Divine Shield. Most of the time you're just using it as a ping. And it just shows the rest of your options aren't that good either. This is a bad meta. This is a underpowered low meta. And in underpowered low metas, hero powers matter. Pings are very good, but Warlock is especially good. There is no ability in this meta outside of Stoneborn Accuser to really push. And Stoneborn Accuser has to be charged up. And Stoneborn Accuser is one of the best neutral cards available right now. And in this meta, it is even better, because it's one of the only ways to end the game. Without the ability to push, and I'll argue that a lot of people are just playing it wrong as well against Warlock, because they haven't had to worry about this in the same way that they used to. But without the ability to push, the Warlock hero power is insane. Without the ability to push, the Warlock hero power is like 14 cards. You're not going to come back from 14 cards down as your opponent. Like, yeah, it'll take some mana here and there, but like, it's up to 14 cards, technically. In reality, it's probably a lot less than that. But still, like, how are you going to come back from being down 5 cards even? Like, at the start of the game, essentially.
I think 5 is realistic. I think 5 is very, very realistic, right? Like, just saying it's a 5-card advantage/disadvantage, whatever, that's a ton. Like, we keep on saying that, card advantage has been like mattering less and less, but it still matters. And what's really
it matters a lot now.
It matters a lot more now, but also it's because if all of your cards suck except for 2 cards, hey man, 5 extra draws to get to that giant card, that's pretty freaking good. Yeah.
Getting to your A tier and above cards is super, super important, and Warlocks are just better at it.
Yeah, definitely.
That's kind of why Warlocks are the best right now. It's really not because of their cards. And obviously they can nerf certain cards offering rates, and it'll bring Warlocks down a bit. But right now, what's making Warlocks go crazy, it's not even that crazy. The win rates are kind of like in line. But what's making Warlock best is really just that hero power. And if you're facing Warlocks, and you will face a lot of Warlocks at the top, it'll just be Warlock Paladin, Warlock Paladin. And if you're facing a Warlock, just remember the stuff that if you've been playing this game for more than 5 years, you knew how to beat Warlocks back in the day. You hit them to the face. You don't bump Yetis against Warlocks. Like, Warlocks can't really buff. They can just, like, destroy their own minions. Or they can destroy, like, all the minions. You're not really worried too much about that. So just hit them to the face. any possible time you could hit them to the face, just think of it as gaining card advantage. Did you deal 4 damage to your opponent's face and your opponent's a warlock? You've just removed 2 of their cards. Oh my god, that's huge when you're talking about the end game. So, my philosophy in facing warlocks is basically just that, look, if they have an insane card, they're gonna win. This applies to every single class, right? If they have an insane card, and I don't, because you will not have an insane card in this meta in, like, I don't know, 80% plus of your decks. You just won't. So if they have an insane card and I don't, and they draw that insane card, I lose. Period. That's just written off. So that means I'm approaching every single game as if they do not have an insane card and I don't have to worry about it. This goes beyond just like, I don't play around Ysera, I don't play around Sire. I don't play around anything that is good. Because it is so rare for anybody to have a good card in this meta.
It's just way too punishing to play around these. Not to not play around them, it's too punishing to play around it. Deathborn doesn't exist. I mean, Deathborn hasn't existed for me personally for the longest time. Now, that does make any Deathborn extra frustrating. Like, the feeling sucks. But yes, if you have been playing around Deathborn, I wouldn't say all the time. You know, I'm sure there are situations in which you can play around it. It makes sense to. But you've also been there before in which it's like, oh, well, I can make it so that they don't completely clear my board and get 6 skeletons. They could just clear 80% of my board and only have, like, you know, 5 skeletons and I still have a minion. Oh, maybe that's good. It's like, no, that doesn't matter.
No, like, go even farther than that. If I can make a move where they would clear me and have 7 skeletons versus a move where they would not clear me at all and only get 1 skeletons, and the move in which they would get 7 skeletons is like 5% better if they don't have a Deathborn, I'm going with that move every single time. Because they don't have a Deathborn. And if they do have a Deathborn, they could just not play it on that turn, and you will be screwed on another turn because it's an S tier card. Like, you don't have enough power in your deck to beat Deathborn. Period. If they have it in their hand, you lose. So just don't worry about it. Like, I'm not even talking about, like, oh, I'm not going to step down from 7 skeletons to 6 skeletons. No. I don't even care if I can make that Deathborn unplayable the next turn. That's still the wrong move. As long as the other move is 5% better or 2% better, whatever, right? Like, if they don't have a Deathborn. And that's kind of the problem, right? Like, the game has deviated between the super powerful cards that kind of win you the game, or the super powerful cards that have a chance to win you the game and it's RNG, either way, if it triggers, and all the normal cards. And so, your entire game plan can't consider any of these super powerful cards because there is no scenario in which you could beat them in any case. Like, before you could at least push hard, and then the, like, higher mana ones you don't get to as much. Nowadays, you can't even push that much. Like, this rotation is so bad, you not only don't have card draw, but you also can't push. So, you just have to bump Yetis. Like, people are bumping Yetis because that's usually the right move in this meta. It's not because they're, like, really dumb and they're just bumping Yetis. Unless they're facing Warlocks, then they're sometimes dumb and they're bumping Yetis when they shouldn't do it. But outside of that, like, one scenario, which does happen a lot, but because Warlocks are the top class, but generally people are just, like, bumping Yetis because that's the optimal EV move to do in any particular situation. And when it comes to card advantage in this meta, it does matter, right? Like, that's why Warlocks are so good in this meta, because card advantage does matter. You don't have Skullomance anymore, and you really don't have that many ways to draw cards outside of being a Warlock. Because your main card draw card in this meta is Fool. And Fool requires you to be charged up, is not really offered that much, and is kind of awkward to play. So if you ever get offered a Fool, definitely take it. It's a game-changing card. But when you're playing against your opponent, the chances your opponent is, like, charging up a Fool and will, like, all of a sudden draw 3 more cards, and you're like, oh no, is very, very low. So there's nothing to worry about. There's no like fishies coming around like being like, oh, I'm actually 2 cards. There's no Mace Scribe coming around being like, haha, I'm actually more than 3 cards usually. Like, they don't exist anymore. Scalomance is gone. We are in a position now where card advantage matters unless your opponent has a Deathborn, a Ysera, a blah, blah, blah. And those all got nerfed. So the offering rates of those are very, very low now. You'll still see them, right? And when you see them, you lose. Which is why this meta is still like super random, it feels. Like, you'll have a run and it'll go like 0-3, and you're like, well, one game I faced Ysera, and in the other game I faced Deathborn. And then, like in the third game, like I just happened to not hit my curve or like whatever, right? And you're 0-3 with like a totally normal deck. And then the same exact deck can do what like my deck did on Friday night and go 12-0. Because we didn't see any Yseras. That's actually not true. I think we did see a Ysera. We beat a Ysera. But that always happens.
It's a crap card, right?
It's kind of a bad card. Like, we didn't see any Sires, or at least none that triggered. It could have been stuck in someone's hand. I don't know. We didn't see any Deathborns. We would definitely lose if we saw a Deathborn, right? Like, all these A+ tier cards or whatever, we just didn't see any of them. And it's very likely, not that you see none of them, but that any particular match that you're not seeing one of them, even in the high win rates. Because there's just so much crap decks being thrown into the meta right now. Because they nerfed all the good cards offering rate to like 50%. And there's not that many good cards to begin with, because this is a really crappy rotation. So, this is just a long-winded way of like, if you ever looked at the actual win rates on HS Replay by the cards, and you're wondering what the hell is happening with Ethereal Og Merchant, this is why. It's because we're bumping Yetis again. Like, really, we are really bumping Yetis. We were bumping Yetis before the adjustment. Now we're like super bumping Yetis. And it brings me to the second part of this podcast, which is, isn't that supposed to be good? I feel like the community, and I mean, I'm guilty of it sometimes too, but like has this like rose-colored glasses and nostalgia for like when people were bumping Yetis, and they're like, this was when skill mattered, and the good players won, and they won very consistently. They had very high win rates, and we watched Trump, and we watched Hafu, and we watched the Grinning Goat, right, and whomever, and we loved it when they took a okay deck and got 12 wins with it, and that couldn't happen for like the last 3-4 years. It was just not possible. No one was taking an average deck and getting 12 wins with it. Unless the average deck actually had a lot of RNG in it, and that's why it was average. And then they got super lucky, right? But it used to happen not an infrequent amount of times. And I feel like a lot of people look back on that era and was like, that was the skill era. Like, you guys who started playing this game 4 years ago, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, last year, you don't know. You don't even know. You don't even know how much skill was in the arena. And now it's just who gets the biggest bombs, who counter swings the counter swing. Like, it's all this like random BS that's happening. The real skill, when I used to bump my Yeti better than my opponent bumped his Yeti, and I got that one extra card advantage, and so I won the game, that's gone. Well, now it's back. Sort of, mostly. And how does it feel, guys? It's not even like back in Classic. It's more fancy right now than Classic was. We have some Og Merchants. We didn't have Og Merchants before. We had Elven Archers, and we dealt with it. Now we get Og Merchants. We got like Scorpids now. Like, there's some fanciness happening here, right? There's still the infuse mechanic is still in. There's some fancy stuff going on, but overall, like, how does it feel to be like playing on curve and throwing things against each other and having that decide most of your games?
So look, we got to talk about exactly what the Classic meta is, right? Because yeah, it was Yetis. Number one, everybody thinks of past whatever in like nostalgically, right? It's like, oh, 90s music was just better music than the trash we have now.
90s music is so bad. As someone who grew up in the 90s, Like if you just objectively look at like 95% of the music that was produced in, oh my
Well, yes.
god. Like the
Yeah.
only worse music than 90s music was like 80s music and 2000s music. And that's why 90s music seemed like it was better.
Well, it's for example, it's like okay, if you remember, it's like we can list quite a few genres. It's like you remember Nirvana, you remember like Backstreet Boys, you remember Boys to Men, and then you kind of don't remember all of the really bad stuff,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like the real bad stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And the so look, we can talk about the classic meta, and sort of what was good about it, what was bad about it, what was different. But I think one thing that we should just establish right off the bat was people were really bad in the classic meta. If you guys remember the tier list from way back when, Icy Veins tier
Oh
list, right?
yeah.
Like, so we had those tier lists, we had Trump tier lists and everything. Um, we didn't have an understanding of tempo in the way that we do now. The understanding of tempo was really, really short-sighted. It was like, there was this echo chamber in which, if you look at those early tier lists as well, Argent Squire was
Undraftable.
considered, yeah, undraftable, trash tier. Pre-nerf Abusive Sergeant was bad.
Yeah.
That was actually bad. Like a 2-1 that gave the same effect as Dark Iron Dwarf. They were like, it's just too small. It's like, and now we're just like, wait, but it gives the same effect as Dark Iron, and you're not giving up a stat. How could it possibly be bad, right? It's like,
because it's not a drop.
Because it's not a drop, right? So this is one of those things where we were like, oh, okay. Oh, and also Naturalize was.
Oh, Naturalize was like the most laughable card in the game. The most laughable card.
If not like the best, or sorry, the worst card in the game.
F minus tier. Agreed upon by literally every single person outside of Hafu.
And so the interesting thing is, it was actually, I heard it from Hafu's perspective. She at first was also like, oh, we play for value, we trade, we win the board almost completely, and then we go for the win. And it was actually because I remember the story. She was friends with MTG players. And, it makes sense. It was the MTG players who came in with, like, not a fresh eye, but they were like, oh, well, we've been playing a similar game for many years. And it was, I believe it was, like, Koyuki who talked to Hafu, and he was like, dude, why aren't you drafting this insane card, Abusive Sergeant? He looked at Abusive Sergeant. He's like, why aren't you drafting this insane card? She's like, why is it insane? He's like, why don't you think it's insane? Like, you're getting way more than you're supposed to. And then that's when she sort of opened her eyes to it. And I think, it certainly took me a lot longer because I didn't have a Koyuki just yelling at me being like, bro, like, stop doing what these tier lists are telling you and just look at freaking Abusive Sergeant. You should be drafting this thing and just out-tempoing people. So that's number one. Players are just bad. So if we were to go back, and the interesting thing is, this happens with a lot of games. So I also look at competitive Pokemon, like not the card game, like the actual video games. And the interesting thing with that is these formats exist for a long time. So like, for example, the Diamond and Pearl Pokemon games, they're done by now, but the meta lives on. People use emulators and systems to keep playing them, and the meta keeps evolving because people haven't figured out, and the metas keep changing. And I would imagine that for Classic, much would be the same. We wouldn't see all of these like, oh, it's just Yetis and Boulderfist Ogres, and all of these small cards, like, they don't really matter, like, Classic meta people got it like 70% right. And then they were very much so stuck in that 70% for a long time. And then the meta just sort of naturally evolved. We got GVG, and then GVG forced people to like recognize the value of this stuff.
Yep.
A Classic meta, we got it wrong for a long, long time. And if you look at Constructed as well, right? It's like people got it wrong for a long time before the level got significantly higher. So look, that is number one. But number two, there is a huge difference when you're talking about Classic meta bumping Yetis versus now bumping Yetis. These are not the same, okay? Because Classic meta bumping Yetis, that was like, oh man, if I like the Yetis matter, right? The Yetis matter, bumping the Yetis matter. If you bump a Yeti and you can finish it off and you're left with that 4-1 and you can like and then you drop that Boulderfist Ogre on 6 and then you drop that Stormwind Champion on 7. Whoo!
The 6/6 Stormwind Champion on 7.
The 6/6 Stormwind Champion, but you had a board, right? Oh my god. And then dude, if you could drop that Shattered Sun Cleric on 3.
That was insane.
Man. That was insane. GG, noob. So, and this is when it really mattered. Like, you get those advantages. There was no sire to just be like, your 5 turns of advantages, goodbye. I have flipped it by another 5 turns. So, like, I have taken the 5 turns of advantage that you have built up. I've taken it away, and I have built up my own kind of like, 10 mana's worth of not just sort of like play, but like flip, right? It's like, oh, I've taken away 12 mana's worth of stuff on your board, and I have put 10 mana's worth of stuff on my board.
Think about the most ridiculous cards back then in Classic. You had old school Ysera, which gave you 1 card per turn. So you can remove it, and then your opponent would have gotten like maybe Ysera's Body, which counts as 2 cards, and then another card. So that's 3 cards total for 9 mana, plus whatever it costs to play the next card. That's it. That was one of the best cards in the game. Ysera always was one of the best cards in the game. There was Deathwing, the biggest swing. You lost all your cards when you played Deathwing. You had to discard everything. And that was like the big swing card. Everybody is always like, oh my god, if they have a Deathwing, I lose, right? But even that's not replenishing your board. What people were complaining the most about, was just Flame Strike. 7 mana, deal 4 damage to everything on the board. And yes, there were plenty of things, like a Yeti, that had more than 4 health back then. So, that's what people were complaining about, because those were way too big of swings to be allowed in the game.
Yep. No, those swings were way too big, right? And we looked at it and we were just like, oh man, that is unacceptable. You couldn't come back from it, right? The best card draw was like Nourish was great card draw.
Nourish was great.
Nourish was great card draw. Sprint was okay at 7 mana. Sprint was like fine. It was an okay card. So it was just very different. And now, whenever you're talking about bumping Yetis, it is, yes, we're going to bump Yetis, and then we're going to bump mediocre 5-drops, and then there's going to be, you're going to clear with like a Shavara. Okay, we're ramping up a little bit, but none of that matters because a Sire can be dropped at some point. Not a Ysera, like a Sylvanas can be dropped at a point to have the biggest of swing, right? It's like, oh, that's a cute little Shavara flip, but that's, we're still playing like 2018, 2019 Hearthstone. That's the Shavara flip. We're not yet playing 2022 Hearthstone, and the problem is you could be playing, it's like, oh, I'm playing 2016, I'm playing 2017, and then suddenly you get something that's like, oh, welcome to 2022, get wrecked. And that's the problem that you have. So it makes these bumpin' Yetis and this classic meta feel really bad. Because back then, number one, because there were less cards, you could think about like that whole like, do I play around Dark Iron, right? A phrase you never hear at any point anymore. It's like, ooh, do I play around Dark Iron? First of all, Dark Iron was, the one of the premier cards in the game at that time. So it was very predictable, right? Predictability is good for skill testing in some ways. Predictability is good
because you would get reads. You would be like, oh, if he had a Dark Iron, you would have played it before, so he doesn't have a Dark Iron. And then that would like change the entire way you played your next 2 turns.
So here's the thing, right? When, for example, like, that is, it's good in some ways, but at the same time, you always do have to temper that with what I said at first. Yes, the classic meta, I think, was skill testing. Part of it was new, and part of it was we all just sucked. So
Yeah.
if you were to bring it back, I think, and not just because we still remember it, so we're like, oh, it's solved. We were just like, wow, we were so bad back then.
Hmm.
Like we were so bad back then. Like how do you like how are you not able to just handle these simple things? Because there is a lot of craziness right now, and look at the people who are consistently on top of the leaderboards. They are able to internalize a lot of this shit. Like they're able to internalize a lot. And they might not be able to say like, "Oh, okay, I have factored in exactly these 12 cards for the next turn in descending order of not only importance but potential impact on my next turn." They don't do that. But, they've played for so long, they just have a good sense of like, "Okay, I shouldn't tempo out all the way here." Versus like, oh, I gotta go. I just have a feeling that, I have like this 1 to 2 turn window in which I gotta push face. And you know what? If they have me, they have me, but I have a decent read on their hand. And it's not exactly like, oh, it is only Deathborn. It is only this, it is only that. Because let's face it, there's crazy 2, 3 card combinations now. But no, I mean the skill is very high, the frustration level is very high. But if we're talking about the classic meta, I think the most important thing is just like, wow, we were very impressed by the, I think, fairly low skill that everyone had back then.
Hmm.
And, like how good you were. Because I remember when I first got to Infinite, and now I'm thinking back, I'm like, man, my understanding was
Yeah.
pretty lacking.
Oh yeah.
It
Like
was
we
pretty
sucked
lacking.
back then, and we were like some of the best.
Yeah, it was
we were
jarring.
like we were like so good that people just didn't believe that you could go infinite without like extra gold being put in. They're like, no one averages 7 wins. That's absurd. Doesn't matter if you just pick the best class every time. Like you can't touch it. Like maybe if you got mage every single time, maybe. And then we were like, no, we get like way more than 7 wins on average if you pick the best class. Like you could play these other classes too; they're fine, but we were still not that good. Um, okay, so breaking that down, there was 3 points that Merps made. It's kind of intertwined with each other. One is that back then we're not so good, people were not good. Now people are better, which actually makes the game worse because
Yes,
you
it
can't
does.
put your skill upon someone if they are also more or less equally good. It doesn't kind of work, right? Like basically back then it was noobs beating up on noobs, and if you like got one level of understanding above someone else, it made a big difference. Now we're all in like the 100th level, and whether you're at the 102nd level or the 89th level doesn't make that much of a difference most of the time. We all know how to bump Yetis good now, basically. And back then, we didn't really know how to bump Yetis good, even though we thought we did. So right now, if you brought the classic meta back, it would be worse than what the classic meta actually was. Second point is that now you still have 2022 cards. And no matter what you do, even if they are just as rare, if not more rare than 2022, than the Ysera's and the Deathwings were back then, they are still better than the Ysera's and Deathwings are back then. They are actually like twice as good, roughly, as the Ysera's and Deathwings were back then. And so that's a problem because your Yetis didn't change. Like your Yetis got like a little bit better, but these cards doubled in value, and they were already absurd and insane. And I'll add on to that, which is that the legendary offering rate at some point is probably quadrupled now compared to what it used to be. There were like no legendaries before. There are like
Well, you could
legendaries everywhere
generate
now.
and find them. Like back then, there was basically no way to generate them.
Right,
You know?
right. Okay, yeah, so generation adds to that. But even not counting generation, just the pure offering of legendary rates has been
Yeah.
quadrupled since Classic easily.
Yeah.
You just did not see Ysera's back then with any, like, you would go like 10 runs without seeing a single Ysera easily. Not you, but I mean, like, you would not face a Ysera. And that's just not the case anymore, even if there was no generation, even if just the hard ones. And the generation obviously makes the problem even worse. So you're still living in a different world where you get much more frequent of these intrusions to your game, and the intrusions are much worse. If you gave me the old Ysera and you plopped them down, I could still beat like 95% of the people that play the Ysera. Because I'm going face. And, what are the odds that they get Ysera Awakens as their first random card, right? 1 in 5. But I can't do that today. I know they have a Ysera's Awakens. I know I have one turn, and then they're done. I'm done. So that's the second point that was made is that the power level, even in a bad rotation, the top cards are still the top cards. and yeah, maybe there was only 2 points. I lost track of the third one. But either way, the classic meta nowadays kind of just is worse than the classic meta was back then. For the player base. And I'll take one more. Here's the third one. This is one I was going to add on to, which is your point about Dark Iron Dwarfs and playing around Dark Iron Dwarfs. When you have a limited pool to play around, like, I don't know if people remember this history or if they were here from like 7 years ago, 6 years ago. But we used to have a classic meta that was just the classic cards, and then there was only like everybody had like 2 Dark Iron Dwarfs in their decks. Like, this was just normal. And then we kept adding expansions, and it was just, there was no rotation, right? You just kept adding expansions until we got to a certain point where the optimal play was to always never play around anything specific. It was a wild meta. We had, I don't know, maybe like 10 sets at that point, maybe less actually, you just, because the chances of any particular card, even a common spell, which had boosted offering rates at that point, a common class spell, the chance of that being in any deck was like 1/3, and the chances of them having drawn it would be like 1/6. So you would just never play around that stuff, even if it was a flame strike that was common back then. Like, it was, you just don't see it, so you don't play it. So you don't play around it, and that became kind of stale for a lot of people. We got a lot of complaints about it. And so they started doing the rotation system. So that's how the rotation system kind of came to be. But there was a good like half year to a full year period where you would just never play around anything, because you would play around general things, right? Like, my opponent's a priest. What if he has a board clear? You would not get any more specific than that, because there would be like 8 different kinds of super board clears that all do something slightly different, and you just would not, it wouldn't be worth your time to figure out which one of those would ruin you, which one wouldn't, and which ones to play around. You would just be like, I'm either playing around all of them by keeping my board, small and tall, or I'm playing around none of them and just hoping they don't have it. So the rotation system kind of solved that. But that would be the 2 extremes of, hey, I know even the common neutral cards of what I'm playing around and not playing around, and every single turn, I have so much information because of what you did not do. That's a lot of skill. That is a ton of skill. You need a small pool for that. Today, our pool is like 4 times the size of that pool, but not quite the size of the full wild pool at the end of the period before they went into rotations, which is we play around pretty much nothing. Except that the power levels of this has made it so, like we were talking about before, we still play around nothing. We're still playing around nothing now. So even though the amount of sets and variety, they found a nice kind of area. I've always argued that you needed more, actually, like more sets to be added into each rotation. But that would just make this problem worse for this particular problem. But we've still gotten to the point where you don't play around pretty much anything. And it's just correct to not play around pretty much anything. Because rather than the things being so low percent chance to happen, it's now, 1, almost equally low percent chance to happen. Remember, back then, I said there was like around 10 sets, maybe around 8 sets, who knows, right? Now there's like around 4 sets, but we've nerfed the offering rates of the truly terribly large cards, right? Like of the really bad cards, and we nerfed them by half. So you see those cards now about the same amount of times as you did back then on the cards that you would not play around, and everyone was like, no one's playing around stuff, it's correct not to play around stuff, this is boring. So we've fallen back into that trap by lowering the offering rates of the top cards in terms of how fun is this game, right? Like, obviously, and in some ways, how skillful is this game? Because if I'm getting reads on Dark Iron Dwarf and knowing every single card, that is a skill. I don't know if that's a skill that they want to be promoting, because that's very game sense kind of memorization. Like, do you know the game or do you not know the game, right? It's not like, are you smart or not? Or are you strategic or not? It's a mix of strategy and knowing stuff. But we have gone too far to the other side, is kind of what I'm saying. And I don't know if that's fixable or not. But it is, just by pure numbers, we've gotten to that same point that they were like, oh, we can't have that. We're actually moving into a rotation so that we will give you more copies of the same card so that you can play around these cards. And you add compounding issue on top of that, the fact that a lot of these cards that are really, really good, you can't play around anyway. or like we were discussing before, if you played around it, it would just be the wrong move in pretty much every single scenario. So you would just never like look into playing around Deathborn, right? I set a very clear rule from the. This is even before the nerf and the Maw meta, even the prior meta. If they have a Deathborn, they win. Easy. I'm okay with that. That is the correct move. Now, if they have a Deathborn, they definitely win. The 5% like efficiency I was giving up because I don't want to deal with it no longer exists. I'm giving up 0 efficiency now. Nobody should be thinking about Deathborn at all. And it's not the classic meta. So it may, on the ground, any particular match may feel like the classic meta if you take it in isolation out of the meta. But within the whole realm of the meta, it's actually so much worse than the classic meta, and the classic meta wouldn't be that great today anyway. Even assuming that we do not have rose-colored glasses, and that the classic meta back then, at everyone's skill level back then, was actually pretty good, right? Like, it could also just be the case that people are always nostalgic about something, right? This is why we fell in love with the game. Obviously, that meta had to have spoken to us, or else we would not have loved the game so much. There's a survivor bias coming in here a bit from the old people here, at least.
True, survivor bias is huge here, right? In which a lot of people have left. A lot of people don't care anymore because they left. And if you are still listening to this podcast, or if you're like us who are still making this podcast, and if you still care about Arena to that extent for this long, then it means you're pretty messed up in the head, and you got some particular tastes, right? So yes, it's definitely survivor bias here. Like, we are the weird ones who lasted this long, but we're definitely weird.
Yes, we are definitely weird. We should not be trusted. That being said, I thought that was a pretty good and thorough analysis of kind of what this meta is, how to do well in this meta, and why this meta sucks. And I think it's pretty widespread. You would think, and by the way, I'm not saying like skill matters a lot less in this meta. I mean, it doesn't matter as much as it should, but there's still elements, right? You still have to like get to the bar. Like, if I'm saying like, oh, if my skill level is 103, I'm not really styling on the person who's skill level 80, like that's 98, the way that I would be with a 5 skill level difference if I was 10 and they were 5, like back in the day. Like, I can't do that anymore because you don't really see a lot of those people. And when you do, all of chat makes fun of them so vigorously because they just so rarely see this. Chat is always like, anytime chat sees someone who is making like more than, sometimes only one misplay, but if they make more than one misplay in a match, they're like, this is like staged. I never get these opponents. Like, what is happening? What is the streamer luck that you're matched up against like the one noob that still plays Arena and is at like 2-1? Like, it doesn't exist anymore. Like, maybe if this was 0-2, we'll give you a pass and we say this could happen. But if this is like 2-1, 3-1, 4-2, these people don't exist. It's a different place now. We're just all in a different place, and this whole thing, like, you still can't be so bad, right? Like, I'm saying if I'm 103 against a 98 person, but there are people out there who are like, maybe they're not still level 5, but maybe they're level 50, and yeah, I will outplay someone who's level 50 if I'm, skill level 103. It will be noticeable. They will lose like most of the games that they're supposed to win against me. But those people don't exist that much in the arena, and they don't get high wins very often, so that I would meet them in matches that actually matter. And it's just, usually now you're seeing 103s against 90 and 98s, and it just doesn't matter that much. So does skill matter? Yes, but like not that much.
Okay. Alrighty. So, anything else you want to talk about there?
No, I thought we covered the kind of meta pretty well. I find this to be like a super boring meta, and I've done like very well too. We put like 2 12-win runs up there in our last like 5 runs or something. So it's a meta I'm doing well in with bad decks. Like they may be average for this meta, or maybe even very slightly above average. I don't even know anymore. But they're bad. They feel bad. They like, there's nothing going on. Like my 12-0 run, I told you, it had 2 A tier cards that were evil geniuses. And they like got me actually good cards exactly twice in the entire run. The other times they were like, here's a normal card, right? Or they're like,
I almost had another one up there too. I had a 10-win hunter that, just wasn't enough. Just wasn't enough.
Yeah.
But it was aggro. Yeah, it was
like
we go even further than bumping Yetis. It's me dropping 1-drops all the time, right?
Super aggro still works, right? If you think Deathborns can't exist, just go super aggro. Because Deathborns can't exist anyway. They're going to win if they have the Deathborn, no matter if you're super aggro or kind of aggro or mid-rangey. So then why bother going mid-rangey? Why not just hit them to the face? Yeah, it's I don't know. I mean, when you hear this stuff, you may be like, well, if you guys are doing so well in this meta, like, then clearly skill matters, right? If you guys are good and you guys are doing well, that's a good sign. This is a meta. Well, I don't think the skill matters that much. I think it's a bit of luck and it's a bit of whatever else. But even if skill mattered, like, it feels so bad. It feels so bad when I'm winning. And not because I'm, like, doing ridiculous things that I'm like, oh, you never had a shot. It's like, yeah, I bumped my Yeti and I can't tell if I like bumped it better than you by a little bit in one or whatever, but like at the end I'm like dominating you. And I could not identify a misplay that you made, even after seeing all of your cards. Now I'm probably not analyzing your plays as much as I'm analyzing my own plays, but still it just kind of felt like we did stuff. I didn't make a misplay. Maybe you made a tiny misplay along the edges. But the big important thing really was that you didn't have a Deathborn, you didn't have a Ysera, and therefore I won. I don't know. I don't know. Different people feel different ways about stuff, right? Like I know people. I never complain about Buffet Biggin, and people complain about that card all the time. And you guys see, every time I see a Buffet Biggin, I pretty much beat them. And they nerfed the offer rate, but they didn't nerf the card. So the card's still out there. And whenever I see them, I'm like, yeah, okay, you got a bunch of stats. Let's go. Like, you're a paladin. You're gonna get a bunch of stats sometimes. Can you follow it up with a buff? Okay, I'm in a little bit bigger of a trouble, but, like, I gotta deal with this anyway. Like, you're a paladin. This is just what I'm, like, prepared to deal with if I have any shot of this deck not being, like, a 3/3 deck.
This world that you live in, where Ysera is worse than a River Croc, and Buffet Biggins are just beatable almost every single time. Get me to this world. Like, is it also like tax free? Like, do ponies just visit you with like a chocolate fountain? What?
I don't know. Maybe they do, and I'm just so used to it that I can't even identify that it's happening. But it happens. Like I said, we got a 12-0 Warlock that I predicted would go 6 to 7 wins, and I'm not wrong. That is a 6 to 7 win deck. It's just that everybody we faced was barely better deck than us, or like worse deck than us. There were so many. We were like 6-0 facing someone, and then at the end of the game, I'm like, what happened? They did not play a single A tier card. It wasn't like we rushed them down. I went 20 cards deep. So they probably were like 15 cards deep. They did not play a single A tier card. They lost. But what were they doing at 6-0? It's because they're still doing this at 6-0. It's because if you don't happen to face the Yseras and the Sires and the whatevers, you could take a deck like that as a good player to 6-0. I'm like, they didn't make a misplay. They just flat out had a worse deck than my totally average deck at 6-0. And that's not the only time it happened. It happened a bunch of times after that too. Like, this is just what happens now. And it's equally likely where I was like 0-1 with, a bad deck, sure. But then, like, I face a Ysera and I'm like, oh, okay, well, I lose. Like, my deck can't handle a Ysera. It doesn't matter what I did. If they were able to draw a Ysera, like, my deck can't finish the game in under 10 turns either. Because there's no way to push for most decks. So I'm just sitting here waiting to see if you draw your Acera. Oh, you drew your Acera, you win. Good job. Good job. You may have had 3 misplays, but it doesn't matter. You're fine. I don't know. Not my meta. It is worse than the classic meta. I don't think it's a rose-colored glasses. I think for all the reasons that Merps and I have listed and delved into, this is worse than the classic meta. But it is imitating the classic meta. And that's one of the problems, is trying to imitate the classic meta.
Yep. All right. That
All
was a
right.
good discussion.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? Do we have a question from the GOAT, or are we wrapping this up?
Okay, look, instead of a question from the GOAT, I'll just do a small PSA here.
Okay.
I will say, okay, here's something I have been doing recently. Now, you can say, Merps, you haven't been playing a lot. That's true. What I do, though, essentially, the games I do play, I like to look at replays, because I think that instead of just spamming games, I learn a decent amount from the meta. By looking at what they also could have played, right? Because you get a decent sense of like power level, all of this stuff. Plus, I think games are just interesting right now, and I've always liked to look at replays. You would think, all right. So first of all, there was me, kind of praising or like kind of dissing the people from before and being like the skill level was really low. Now it's time for me to just say, you guys, my opponents that I have these replays of, and that others have deemed worthy opponents, you guys suck at mulliganing. I'm not saying I'm a god at the mulligan, but if you guys are out there looking for ways to improve your game, my god, you got to mulligan better.
How are they mulliganing?
They're keeping like, okay, what they're doing is okay. For example, they don't have the coin, and they're keeping a 3/4 and a Fire Plume Phoenix, something like that. And
What?
Yes, so
does their deck have 2-drops?
Not that, so I can see like half of their deck by the time the game ends, right?
Oh, okay.
Approximately.
Okay.
So I don't know. Maybe I don't see that they have a ton of 2-drops. But
or no 2-drops either way, right? Like if you have like no 2-drops, you may just give up.
Some, and I was just like, what is this? I'm like, so first of all, they're keeping like a when I say a 3-mana 3/4, I mean just a 3-mana 3/4.
Yeah,
it's not like
a spider tank.
It's not Duster. It is
right.
Essentially spider tank because it has like an extra thing, but it doesn't matter, right? It never, it never matters. So, in that case, I hope you guys can see what's wrong with that. In that, if you're keeping a 4 without the coin, it should be real good. Like, it should be real good. Fire Plume Phoenix is like not good enough.
And also, you just don't do it because you don't have real good cards in this meta. So if you're wondering if my 3-drop is real good and you're like holding a Duster, like that's maybe fine as a 3-drop. But if let's say Duster's like a 4-drop and you're trying to hold it, you don't hold a Duster. Like a Yeti Duster is not a card you would hold, even if you have a 3-drop. It is not good enough. So that means none of your 4-drops are good enough.
I see some of these games in which, like, let's say the end was super duper close, right? Like the end result was super duper duper close. And I'm like, I go back and look, I'm like, how do you keep this?
Yeah.
Or what they'll do, okay, some people with the coin, they'll keep a 4-drop. Like a 4-drop with some slight upside.
And then throw the rest away?
Yes. And I'm like, what is this? What are you doing? Like, there's no way that this was good enough. And I don't care what it's like. I can't even imagine what the justification is. I don't want to hear it. Like, it's just really bad. So I've done episodes before on sort of what you want to do for mulliganing. Mulligan hasn't changed that much. Power levels have changed. The fundamental principles of mulligans have stayed pretty similar in what you want to think about. The steps that you think about are really the same. You got to learn those. Get back to those.
Mm,
If you're wondering what is holding you back, I
yeah.
would say, because I'm still seeing this, like, I'm like, oh, let's see what my 8-win, 9-win opponent is doing for mulligans.
Hmm.
And I'm just like, there's no way. Like, you clearly do not understand the mulligan. And we all make mistakes. I'm not saying I mulligan perfectly, but I try to think of these things. The answer to my question that I posed to myself could be wrong, right? I could mess up there. But if I'm asking that, I will get it right sometimes. These individuals I'm facing, I don't think are asking themselves any questions. So in which case, if you never ask the question, you will literally never get it right. Um, so that's an easy way. And it kind of shocked me because I've been watching more replays recently.
Hmm.
And I'm just like, dude, it's 8 years after the game has come out. If you're playing Arena, you're probably not playing this new. Whether you have lost it or you never picked up the skill, dude, that's an easy half a win to, I would say, a win on your average. Just going through the basics, learn how to mulligan, how to let go. And so easy because that's the snowball right there, right? And especially in this meta in which like if you want to play aggressively, if you want to play a little bit aggro, you can squeeze out some extra wins. So important, right?
Yep.
And I see some of these people, maybe they are just, the way that they mulligan is great in certain metas with certain decks,
Hmm.
but then they just don't,
They don't adjust when it
they
gets to
don't
the more
adjust,
tempo
right?
meta.
Yeah, yeah. Meanwhile, I'm over here, for example, with some of my hunter decks, I have like a decent two, in my mulligan, and like, I'll have like, um, I don't have the coin. I'm going first, and I get a decent 2-drop and a decent 3-drop. I toss both of those away because I'm like, neither of those are 1-drops. I have enough 2-drops, and I have really good 2-drops. I need that one, right?
Hmm.
I need that one. So all of these are getting tossed away. So you got to adjust according to the deck. That's just a PSA because it was kind of shocking. I'm like, wow, tons of people are really bad at mulliganing.
Yeah, and
Like,
keep in mind,
yeah.
like if Merps is doing this and I am doing this, and I don't know what our win rate is, somewhere between 70 and 75%, I imagine, and you're considering doing something more conservative, and you're at like 60 or 65% win rate, then you're like really wrong, right? Because you want to be more conservative and not suffer the bad RNG the better of a player you are. Like in our position, we are still throwing these cards away in order to not be conservative and just settle for stuff and to try to roll pure RNG. There's no skill in in what you get back from a mulligan. So if we're willing to do that, that means that that's a 70-75% plus EV play. And if you're sitting there at 60-65% not doing this, then you're suffering at least a -10, if not more, percent EV on your mulligan itself. And that's every game.
Yep. Okay, that's my PSA. Um, you guys should be excited for those of you who are like, oh wait, I haven't really thought about the mulligan in a long time. Um,
I haven't thought about the mulligan. It hasn't like bothered me, but we've been okay. To be fair, we're more aggressive mulliganers than most people. I feel, and we generally play more tempo than most people. But you can't keep mediocre 4-drops. You just can't. I don't care if you have a 3-drop, unless you have a 2 and 3-drop. You're not keeping like any 4-drops.
it also just really depends on your deck, knowing what
Sure, but you're not
but
keeping any 4-drops.
yeah, yeah. So these are things that you really want to reassess, and if it's been years and you're just like, man, I still take arena seriously. I'm trying to go for higher or even onto the leaderboard. I can't seem to break through. The mulligan, I think, is one of the most controllable, I
Hmm.
would say, easiest ways to raise your win rate by a huge amount. And this has always been something in which, like, oh man, people love talking about drafting, which pick
Yeah.
is correct, right? People
Hmm.
love talking about plays. They love talking about reading hands. Like, these are all like the tricky things people love talking about. Mulligan beats all of those in terms of impact. Like, the impact of the mulligan on your win rate is so big. So you nail that down, and like it's such an easy switch as well. Like, just not doing some of these things. Like, I'm not saying it's like, okay, you have to identify exactly what you do. Just by identifying a lot of things that you don't do, that'll improve your win rate substantially. You will be a happier person because of this. And you might get less frustrated by the meta. You might just be like, these dumb aggro decks just keep beating me down. And it's like, dude, you kept a Yeti. Like, what are you doing? What was that supposed to do?
Stop the one drops. Yeah, that's really good advice. And if you guys have not examined your mulligans recently, whether you think you have this problem or not, like, just pay more attention to the mulligans, especially when you don't have the coin. Because when you don't have the coin, it's very rigid. It's very rigid. And I would wager that people are too conservative with their mulligans, meaning they're not giving up the cards that are mediocre. Like, they're just settling with it. And you could settle with it if you have a 2 and a 3 drop, right? Like, fine. Like, it's not, you know, maybe your deck is just that bad or whatever. But if you're settling for anything, if anything is not looking at you and being like, I am a spectacular card played on curve, then you better have your full curve up to that point to keep it. No holes. If you're rolling at all for anything, you want more rolls. If you're mulliganing away, you have 3 cards, right? If you're mulliganing away, and you always draw 1 card. So if you mulligan away nothing, you start at 1. If you mulligan away 1 card, you double the rate. If you mulligan away 2 cards, you double the rate, and then you add another 50% chance to get the card, to get a suitable card. And if you mulligan all 3 away, you double, and then you double again your chance of getting the card that you want. Like, those are absurdly good odds. Like, you want that. Okay, that's it for us. We will see you guys next week. Until then, this is ADWCTA.
This is Merps. See you guys.
Bye.